"Can I sit here?" The question fell softly, almost hesitant, but it cut through the hall like a stone thrown into still water. For a second, the music, the clinking glasses, the chatter, all seemed to hold its breath. Then came the laughter, low at first, then rising, spilling across the long banquet table draped in white linen and crystal. He stood at the edge of that table, cap held in his hand, his shoulders slightly bent, his boots carrying the dust of streets no one in that room had walked for years. His name was Daniel Ward, 51 years old. A man who had spent decades building what others now lived in. Bridges, towers, schools. Concrete still clung to his hands, though he had scrubbed them until the skin went raw. Yet here, in this room of silk ties and polished cufflinks, his presence was treated as a mistake. "You've got the wrong place, friend," a young man in a tailored navy jacket said, smirking as he sipped his champagne. "This isn't the bus station." The table erupted again. A woman with diamonds hanging from her ears whispered loudly enough for him to hear, "Look at his boots. He'll stain the carpet if he stands there too long." Daniel didn't move. His eyes were steady, fixed on the empty chair halfway down the table. A chair with a small folded card, resting on the plate. He couldn't see the writing from where he stood, but he knew. That chair had been meant for him, the host's assistant, a man with slicked-back hair and an impatient twitch, came forward. "Sir, you need to step aside. This is a private dinner." "I worked on this hall," Daniel said quietly. His voice was low, but the words carried. "I helped pour the foundation when this place was nothing but mud and steel." The assistant chuckled and turned to the crowd, as if to confirm how absurd that sounded. "And now you think that earns you a seat at this table?" The laughter grew sharper, colder. Forks tapped on crystal. Someone mimicked his words with a mocking tremor. "I worked on this hall," earning another round of cruel amusement. Daniel's face did not change. His cap remained in his hand. His shoulders stayed straight. But the weight of every glance pressed on him. Glances that dismissed, that erased, that treated him as less than air. He was not a guest, not a man, not even a presence to acknowledge. He was an inconvenience. A woman at the far end leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "Why do they even let people like him in here?" "Security should do its job," her neighbor replied. "He probably just wants free food. These people always do." The irony hung in the air, bitter and cutting. This event had been advertised as a charity dinner to celebrate the hands that built the city. Posters plastered across town had carried those words in bold print. Daniel had seen them. They had been his reason to come. He had believed them. And now, standing in the very place he had helped raise, he was treated like a trespasser. "Sir, you need to leave," the assistant said again, his voice sharper. "We can't have you disrupting this evening." Daniel's lips pressed together. He looked once more at the chair, then back at the assistant. "That seat is mine." The room erupted once more, but this time the laughter was edged with something crueler. Guests leaned closer to one another, whispering, smirking, shaking their heads as though the idea itself was madness. "He thinks he belongs here," someone sneered. "He's delusional," another voice muttered. A waiter walked past, carrying a tray of appetizers, and turned his eyes quickly to the floor, unwilling to meet Daniel's gaze. Even the staff avoided him, afraid to be linked to his shame. He stood alone, surrounded by silk and glass and scorn. The injustice wasn't in the words alone. It was in the way no one saw him as valid. No one recognized that the ground beneath their polished shoes had once been mud in his hands. He had been irreplaceable when concrete was wet and steel was rising. Now, in the glow of chandeliers, he was invisible. As the laughter ebbed into whispers, Daniel remained still. His presence unsettled them more than his words. He was not raging. He was not begging. He was simply there, refusing to vanish. If you've ever known the sting of being dismissed in a place where you once gave your strength, you'll understand why moments like this matter. And I'd like to hear your thoughts, share them, because these stories become more powerful when more voices are added. At the table, the young man in the navy jacket leaned back in his chair. "Tell you what," he said loudly, making sure the crowd could hear. "If that chair really has your name on it, prove it. Otherwise, don't waste our time." The assistant's hand hovered near Daniel's elbow, as if to guide him out. "Last chance, sir." Daniel's eyes didn't waver. "I said, that seat is mine." Silence followed, sharp and tense. Even those who had been laughing moments ago now watched, curious despite themselves. Something in his voice, steady and unshaken, unsettled them. You can sense how a room changes when truth lingers unspoken. And if stories like this one remind you of moments in your own life, stay with us. We share them here often, because dignity deserves a place at the table. The chandeliers hummed overhead, the music had gone quiet, and all eyes stayed fixed on the man who refused to disappear. The silence that followed Daniel's words lingered in the air, longer than the laughter ever had. People looked at one another as if waiting for someone to give permission to sneer again. But no one spoke. Daniel lowered his cap slowly, his thumb brushing the worn brim, and for a moment his mind drifted back to another time, years ago, before the dust settled in his hair, and before his back ached at night. He had been the one standing in the sun from dawn until dusk, guiding younger men on construction sites. He wasn't a leader by title, but everyone listened to him. He knew where beams should go, how concrete should settle, how to keep a wall straight even when the ground wanted to shift. People trusted him, and when the building that now glowed under chandeliers was just rebar and scaffolding, Daniel had been there every day, checking measurements, steadying ladders, carrying more than his share without complaint. At home, things had been different. His wife, Claire, had battled illness for years. Medical bills stacked higher than bricks on any site. He had tried to keep her comfortable, working overtime, missing sleep, but never missing the way her hand felt in his. When she passed, Daniel did not speak of it much. He simply worked harder, raising their son alone. That son was grown now, away studying, unaware that his father stood tonight in a room full of strangers who thought him less than nothing. Daniel's eyes returned to the empty chair. He could almost see Claire's face there, smiling, urging him not to step back. She had always said, "Dignity isn't what others hand you. It's what you carry when no one else sees." Around him, the table buzzed with whispers again. "He looks lost. Maybe he just wandered in. Security should really do something." But Daniel's focus stayed on that folded card resting on the plate. He didn't need to read it to know. It had been promised. A seat for him. An invitation that had reached him not through glossy envelopes or personal assistance, but through a friend who said, "The CEO hasn't forgotten what you did." Daniel remembered the day clearly. Years earlier, on a work site, a scaffolding had collapsed. People screamed, steel twisted, dust filled the air. Amid the chaos, he had pulled a young man out, his arm bleeding, ribs cracked. That young man had been a junior manager, the type others barely noticed. Daniel hadn't thought of it since, but the friend who told him about tonight said the man was no longer junior. He was the CEO now, and he had insisted Daniel should be honored at this dinner. No one in the hall knew that. To them, Daniel was just another face in worn clothes. The injustice wasn't just that they laughed. It was that they never even paused to ask who he was. To them, he was invisible. A waiter passed again, tray balanced high. This time, the young man offered Daniel a glass of water, quickly, discreetly, almost guiltily. Daniel nodded once. Small kindnesses mattered, even in rooms like this. If you've ever walked into a place where people decided who you were before you opened your mouth, you'll understand why these moments cut deep. And if you've lived through it, I'd value hearing what stayed with you, because it's often in those small details we find the truth. Daniel lifted the glass, the cool water steadying him. He didn't want pity. He wanted acknowledgement. Not applause, not titles, just acknowledgement that his hands, though rough, had shaped the very walls now holding the laughter that tried to push him out. A man at the table leaned back, arms crossed. What's he waiting for? He doesn't belong here. Daniel heard, but he didn't react. He had been underestimated his whole life. Tonight would be no different. Yet deep inside, the certainty remained. That seat was his. And sometimes, certainty unsettles a crowd more than anger ever could. Stay with us if stories like this remind you that respect, once denied, leaves a mark. This space is where we uncover those marks and bring them to light, and you'll always find more of them here. The murmurs continued, but so did Daniel's silence. Around him, the music faltered. Conversations turned half-hearted, as if even the cruelest among them sensed something was about to give. The whispers turned bolder. No one wanted silence anymore. Silence gave the man weight. Laughter was safer. Laughter turned him into nothing more than a joke they could share. The young man in the navy jacket tapped his glass with a fork until the room quieted just enough for his voice to carry. "All right," he said. Lips curled in a grin. "Let's settle this. If this stranger thinks he belongs, let him prove it." Eyes swung back toward Daniel. He hadn't moved. He was still standing with his cap at his side, shoulders drawn, but not bent. The grin on the young man's face widened. "Tell us, old friend, what have you done to deserve that seat? Enlighten us. Because from here, it looks like you wandered off a job site and lost your way." The crowd chuckled, leaning closer, as if the scene were entertainment. A woman with lacquered nails covered her smile with her hand, pretending to be discreet, but her laughter still spilled out. Daniel's jaw tightened once, then eased. "I built here," he said quietly. "This hall, those walls." He gestured, hand steady. "For years I worked so these floors could stand." The young man clapped slowly, mocking applause. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have our builder. Perhaps he'd like to check the plumbing next." Laughter rippled again, sharper this time. A woman near the center raised her glass and added, "I'm sure the city owes him many thanks. But tonight isn't about dirt under fingernails. Tonight is about those who make things happen." Daniel's eyes shifted briefly toward her, but he didn't answer. He didn't need to. Her words had already drawn nods from the table, confirming the unspoken rule: builders build, but they don't sit among those who own what is built. The assistant reappeared, voice firm. "Sir, this is turning into a disturbance. If you don't step out, I'll have to ask security to escort you." Daniel didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the folded card by the empty chair. "I told you," he said, voice even. "That seat is mine." The young man leaned forward now, eyes gleaming with the pleasure of cruelty. "Then go on. Convince us. Tell your grand story. What makes you worthy of sharing a table with people who matter?" Daniel stayed silent. He didn't rattle off projects. He didn't list sacrifices. He simply looked at the seat, calm against the storm of mockery. The silence unsettled them. Laughter faltered when there was nothing to fight against. But cruelty has a way of feeding itself. Another voice rose. "Maybe he's here for leftovers." More laughter. "Check his pockets before he leaves." The waiter who had given Daniel water looked down again, gripping the tray tighter. Around him, the staff moved more quickly, avoiding eye contact, not wanting to be seen as sympathetic. The assistant's hand hovered near Daniel's arm. Last warning. Daniel finally looked up. His eyes swept across the table, meeting gaze after gaze. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You laugh because you think I don't belong. But I was here before you ever were, and I'll still be here when your laughter fades." The words landed like cold steel. No poetry, No flourish, just fact. A shiver of discomfort rippled through the hall. The young man's grin faltered, then returned, thinner now, forced, fine words. But words don't buy you a place. Injustice hung thick in the air. Daniel had not shouted, had not begged, yet his refusal to vanish had turned their spectacle into something raw. And if you've ever watched someone treated as if their very presence was a mistake, you know how hard it is to stay quiet. That's why spaces like this matter. This is where stories are told straight, and if you want to keep hearing them, staying with us ensures they aren't drowned out. The assistant gestured, and two uniformed men stepped forward. The hall buzzed with anticipation, like an audience waiting for the final act of a play. All Daniel did was lower his cap once more, thumb brushing the worn fabric, eyes steady. The spectacle they craved was turning into something else, something no laughter could soften. The two security men stopped just short of touching him, waiting for a nod from the assistant. Daniel stood still, his cap pressed against his chest. Around the table, eyes glittered with the thrill of seeing him forced out. They wanted the moment finished, the irritation removed, but not every gaze carried the same weight. A waitress, no older than 20, stood by the wall with a tray of empty glasses. She had been watching quietly since the moment Daniel asked for the seat. Unlike the others, her eyes didn't hold mockery. They held a question. She had seen the way he carried himself, the way he didn't flinch when ridiculed. Something about it didn't match the picture the crowd had painted. As she moved past him to clear plates, she whispered quickly, "Don't leave." It was low, almost inaudible, but Daniel heard. He gave the slightest nod. Farther down the table, an older man in a gray suit leaned forward. His face was lined, his eyes cautious. He whispered to the guest beside him, "I know that man. Years ago, on a site downtown." His neighbor frowned, dismissive, but the older man kept staring, memory pulling at him. He said nothing more. Fear of ridicule sealed his lips, but recognition had already cracked through the crowd's certainty. The assistant cleared his throat, eager to restore control. "Gentlemen, remove him." Daniel's hand rose, not in protest, but pointing calmly to the folded card on the empty plate. "That seat," he said, steady and cold. "It was kept for me." The hall erupted again. Laughter. Scoffs. The shake of heads. "He's gone mad," someone muttered, imagining invitations. But Daniel didn't step back. His eyes stayed on the chair, as if nothing else existed. The waitress froze mid-step, tray balanced, her face pale. She knew what she had heard when setting the table earlier. That card had been placed with unusual care, and she had been told not to move it. The crowd didn't know. They only saw a man refusing to be erased. That refusal unsettled them more than shouting ever could. The spectacle had become uncomfortable. Their laughter grew thinner, uncertain. You know that uneasy feeling when truth sits in a room but no one dares name it? That's the edge where stories like this matter most. And if moments like this strike you the way they strike me, you'll want to stay connected here, because it's in remembering them together that they hold their weight. The young man in the navy jacket leaned forward again, voice sharp. "You think some card saves you? That seat isn't yours. Stop embarrassing yourself." Daniel's eyes finally met his. "Embarrassment," he said, voice dry as stone, "is forgetting who built the ground you stand on." The words landed heavy. No flourish, no anger, just plain truth. The young man's smirk faltered, and for the first time, silence spread wider than laughter. At the wall, the waitress lowered her tray slowly. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes stayed locked on Daniel. She understood now. This wasn't a man begging for scraps. This was a man holding ground others were trying to erase. And in a room built on pretense, even one silent ally was enough to shift the air. The assistant raised his hand, ready to give the order that would drag Daniel out for good. The two security men shifted forward. The table leaned in, hungry for the spectacle to finally be finished. But then the doors opened. The music stopped entirely, as if even the strings understood who had just entered. A tall figure walked in, flanked by silence. The CEO had arrived. Every guest rose quickly, eager to be seen standing, glasses raised in polite acknowledgement. Applause scattered through the hall, thin but urgent. The young man in the navy jacket straightened his tie and smiled wide, prepared to greet power. The CEO didn't look at him. His eyes scanned the room once, then stopped on Daniel. His steps slowed. His face changed. Recognition flashing sharp and undeniable. The laughter died without a word. The CEO walked past the waiting crowd, past the guests who had prepared flattering remarks, and stopped directly in front of Daniel. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then, in a voice that cut through every whisper, the CEO said, "You came." The room froze. Heads turned sharply. The security men stepped back instinctively. The assistant's hand dropped from the air, his face pale. The CEO placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "This man," he said, voice firm, cold, final, "saved my life." Gasps broke out across the table. Someone dropped a fork. The sound rang louder than it should have. The young man in the navy jacket went rigid. The CEO continued, eyes sweeping across the faces that had mocked. "Years ago, when Scaffolding collapsed, I was trapped. Steel above me, dust choking me. No one moved. But he did. He pulled me out. I wouldn't be standing here tonight if not for him." Silence gripped the hall, heavy and absolute. The CEO turned to the empty chair, lifted the folded card, and held it up. His voice carried no warmth, only truth. This seat was reserved for Daniel Ward, not as a guest, not as a favor, as an honor. The folded card trembled slightly in his hand before he set it back down. Every eye turned toward Daniel now, but not a word left their mouths. The same faces that had mocked him minutes earlier now looked away, unable to hold his gaze. You can feel when a room shifts, when arrogance collapses into shame. It's the kind of moment you don't forget. And if you've ever witnessed power reveal truth in a single sentence, you'll understand why we keep telling these stories. Staying close means you won't miss the ones that matter most. The CEO gestured firmly. "Daniel sits here, tonight, and every time he chooses." The security men stepped back further. The assistant's face was drained of color. The young man in the navy jacket dropped his eyes to the tablecloth, fingers trembling against the stem of his glass. Daniel lowered his cap slowly, his thumb brushing the brim. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He only looked at the chair that had always been his, then at the man who now commanded the room. The truth was out, and no laughter could bury it again. The CEO's hand remained on Daniel's shoulder. His presence was unshakable, his words already carved into the silence. No one dared break it, not even with a cough. Then he turned. His eyes swept the table, pausing on each face long enough to make them shift in their seats. "I heard the laughter from the hall before I stepped inside," he said. His voice was flat, cold, leaving no room for excuse. "I know exactly who it was meant for." The young man in the navy jacket opened his mouth, then closed it again, his lips pale. The woman with diamonds stared down at her plate. The assistant shifted his weight, wishing to disappear. The CEO didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. This event was advertised as honoring the workers who built this city. Yet the one man who poured its foundations was treated like an intruder. His gaze pinned them in place. If that doesn't shame you, nothing will. No one moved. The only sound was the soft clink of a glass as a nervous hand tried to set it down quietly. Daniel stood beside him, silent, watching. He hadn't asked for this defense, hadn't demanded recognition, yet it came sharper than any blade. The CEO raised the folded card once more. This seat was never empty. It belonged to him from the beginning. And you tried to strip him of it. He set it down again, harder this time, the sound loud against the porcelain plate. The crowd flinched. He gestured to the servers standing along the wall. Bring him dinner. The best. And pour him the wine you reserved for me. The waitress who had spoken to Daniel earlier hurried forward, relief in her face. She set a glass in front of him carefully, her hands steady now. The CEO turned back to the guests, his voice lowered, each word cutting sharper. Tonight, every toast will be raised to Daniel Ward. If you can't stomach that, you may leave now. Chairs creaked. Nobody left. You could feel the weight pressing down on every guest. The kind of weight that forces people to look at themselves, even when they don't want to. And I'll say this. Moments like that leave marks. If hearing them matters to you, staying with us ensures those marks aren't forgotten. The young man in the navy jacket finally spoke, his voice thin. We didn't know who he was. The CEO's eyes snapped to him. You didn't need to know. Respect isn't given because of titles. It's owed because of humanity. The words landed hard, cold, undeniable. No one argued again. Daniel finally lowered himself into the chair that had been waiting all along. He placed his cap on his lap and sat straight, his face calm. Around him, glasses trembled in hands not used to holding shame. And for the first time that evening, it wasn't Daniel who looked out of place. It was everyone else. Dinner was served, but no one tasted it. Plates were lowered in front of Daniel, and the wine poured carefully into his glass. The hall remained hushed, as though sound itself was unwelcome. Daniel picked up his fork slowly. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't basking. He simply ate, steady, as if the chair had always been his and nothing unusual had happened. That quiet certainty unsettled them more than any speech could. The CEO stayed beside him, speaking little, but his presence alone was enough. He had turned the banquet from theater into trial, and the verdict had been delivered without appeal. A guest raised his glass finally, voice unsteady. To Daniel Ward. The words cracked as they left his throat. Others followed reluctantly, glasses lifted, eyes averted. The toast carried through the room like an order. Not a celebration. Daniel swallowed his bite, then set his fork down. His voice was clear, but soft. I never asked for toasts. I only asked for a seat. Cold truth cut deeper than any rebuke. Guests shifted uncomfortably, their shame impossible to mask. The CEO inclined his head. You earned more than a seat, Daniel. You earned this city. Daniel shook his head once. No. I earned a living. I earned a roof. For my family. That was enough. He glanced toward the chandeliered ceiling. But respect should never be extra. Respect should be the ground we all walk on. No one laughed now. Not a whisper moved through the hall. And maybe you felt it too, that hunger not for applause or glory, but simply to be seen as human. If you understand that, then you know why stories like this belong here. Stay with us, because remembering them together keeps their meaning alive. The CEO raised his glass high, this time without hesitation. The crowd followed, not daring to refuse. Crystal clinked, but it sounded hollow. Daniel finished his meal quietly, placed his cap back on his head, and stood. I've had enough, he said simply. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't linger for conversation. He walked toward the door with steady steps, leaving behind a room full of eyes that could not look away. The CEO followed him out, leaving his own guests abandoned. Together, they crossed the polished floor that Daniel had once poured with his own hands. The sound of their footsteps echoed louder than the orchestra had all night. Outside, the air was cool, honest, unpolished. Daniel breathed deeply, shoulders easing for the first time. The CEO turned to him. "You gave me my life," he said. "Tonight was only a fraction of what I owe you." Daniel shook his head. "All I ever wanted was the same thing every man deserves. Not to be treated as if he doesn't matter." Months later, the city remembered. A scholarship fund carried his name. Workers spoke of him with pride. And those who had laughed that night? Their silence became their legacy. The story of the banquet spread wider than the walls that had once tried to contain it. Daniel never asked for credit again. He returned to quiet days, steady work, and evenings where the weight of laughter no longer followed him. But the lesson remained. Respect is not a gift to be handed down from the powerful. It is the seat at the table that belongs to all.